So up to this point, we've talked about how psychology transitioned from a philosophy to a science. You learned about structuralism and functionalism, and we really spent some time focusing on how early psychologists focused on the mind. However, that is not what psychology focuses on today. And so what we're going to do in this presentation is we're going to look at how psychological science really developed. And we're going to see how ultimately psychology has come to be defined as the science of behavior and mental processes. I think last presentation, we were able to see some of the science stuff in terms of data collection and experimentation, reliance on that scientific method. We also saw the focus on mental processes, but we definitely did not see any sort of focus on behavior. And so that's what we're going to trace in this presentation. Some of the early approaches that we can now add to structuralism and functionalism that existed early on. The question that we're going to be answering really is how did psychology continue to develop from the 1920s through today? And hopefully you can see, like you could even just in the last presentation, psychology is pretty new. It wasn't that long ago that most of the research was being done. The early days of psychology really aren't that far away. We have a lot of video footage of a lot of the different experiments that are done. There's a lot of really great archival stuff that we have access to because psychology is such a new science. Um, Psychology focused on mental processes up until around the 1920s. So starting with Wundt's lab in the late 1800s, 1879, 1880, through the 1920s, people were really focusing on mental life. You have Wundt and Tishner who are doing like the structuralism thing. You have William James, who's doing the functionalism thing. You have Sigmund Freud, who is doing something called psychoanalysis, looking at the unconscious mind. But no one's talking about behavior. No one's talking about actions. People are just focusing on thought. And the people who were focusing on thought were focusing on a bunch of different components of thought. You have Sigmund Freud, for example, who's possibly the most famous psychologist to ever exist. He has a lot of theories that have influenced psychology even to this day, although he also has a lot of theories that have since been debunked or we've moved away from. But Freud looked at the mind in a different way from a Wundt or a Tishner or a James. What Freud was really focused on is something called the unconscious mind. And he thought that what you do in the world is a product of all these things happening inside of you that you aren't aware of. That you have thoughts and wishes and motivations and dreams that happen outside of your conscious awareness, but that is really what's driving you. Freud was also the first person to really emphasize the role that childhood plays in your adult self. And we're going to spend more time on Freud, especially when we get to psychoanalysis. But it wasn't until behavioral psychologists that we started to see the addition of behavior into the definition of psychology. In the 1920s, there are a bunch of people doing a bunch of research. We have John B. Watson, we have B.F. Skinner, we have Rosalie Rayner. And this collection of people are known as behaviorists or behavioral psychologists. And what behaviorism wanted to focus on are the things that are observable and measurable. Up until this point, you've had psychologists who are, asking people to share what they're thinking about, or you have someone like Freud who's saying, like, you don't even know what you're thinking about, but it's in there. And so people like Watson and Skinner and Rayner wanted to go in a completely different direction. And so behaviorism is this view that psychology first should be an objective science. And this objectivity means there shouldn't be room for interpretation. Freud's unconscious mind was one of the motivating factors for that, but it should be something totally data-based, totally verifiable, really focused on things that you can see and you can measure. And then it's also the view that psychology should study behavior without any reference to mental processes. So behavioral psychologists would say if we're not focused on what an organism is doing or what their environment is doing, then we're wasting our time. And what psychologists nowadays tend to say is there's some truth to behaviorism. It is true that we should try to be objective. It's also true that behavior is important. But what we've moved away from is behavioral psychology's perspective that only behavior matters. We now think that, thinking matters as well. Another early school of thought, if you want to call it that, that emerged in the mid 1900s was humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology was developed by a couple of key people. Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow are big names. And I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you. For this chapter, you do kind of have to start to know what perspective they're associated with. But don't worry, we return to them throughout the year. And humanistic psychology was really focused on sort of the positive aspects of research. Humanistic psychologists wanted to know, how do people achieve health and happiness? They wanted to focus on the potential for growth that each individual has. They were inspired by some of the stuff that Freud's psychoanalysis was talking about, in the sense that Freud focused on how people, end up with issues and what goes wrong in someone's childhood to make them the way that they are. Humanist psychologists said, well, why can't we focus on what makes someone healthy and what's gone right? Humanist psychology also disagreed with the behavioral perspective, which really said that people can be programmed to behave in any way based on environmental consequences. The behavioral perspective of the human is not necessarily the most empowering. It just says, yeah, you're just a product of your environment, and if I can change the environment, I can change what you do. So humanistic psychologists, they really focused on the potential for personal growth that we all have. And they wanted to see what makes someone achieve health. So it's kind of like the feel good version. It's kind of since fallen out of favor, maybe to be replaced by what in modern era we call positive psychology, but it was definitely historically significant. Another thing happening in the 60s was the introduction of cognitive psychology. I guess I should say the reintroduction or maybe the redefinition. Cognitive psych was fully and is fully focused on mental processes, how we think, how we problem solve, how we use language to communicate. And this hopefully sounds a little familiar because when you look at the early days of psychology, they obviously were focused on these same things. But in the 60s, we saw sort of a resurgence in popularity for cognitive psychology. So that brings us to today. Well, sort of. We'll definitely talk more about career options and all that kind of stuff in another presentation. Today, we say that psychology is defined as the science of behavior and mental processes. Like that's the definition. And there's a lot actually packed into that definition. First, we have that behavior component. To say that psychology is the science of behavior means that psychologists really are interested in anything and everything that an organism does. This sort of spans from facial expressions to physiological reactions to really complicated behaviors to learning to all sorts of different types of things. It doesn't just mean how you perform in a really complicated situation. It also means, are your pupils dilated? Are you sweating? What is triggering those kinds of reactions? Do we all make the same facial expressions when we're faced with the same environment? So to say it's the science of behavior means it really does focus on anything and everything that an organism does. But it's also the science of mental processes, which means there is some room for some subjectivity. Psychology does focus on how people feel internally, on how people think and how people process, maybe the ways in which we do that in similar manners and the ways in which we do them differently. And so psychology now is a combination of both of those approaches.